Hello class, today I'm going to talk about the use of solitary confinement and why I am for it. So solitary confinement is known as the isolation of a prisoner in a separate cell as a form of punishment or as a form of discipline in maximum security prisons. In state prisons, solitary confinement is putting away bad inmates who are disobedient or insubordinate for usually short periods of time. And in maximum security prisons, solitary confinement is the default nature of which the prisoners live in, and they're usually in there for 23 hours a day, and they come out for 1 hour, and that's just for recreation. Now, some history on solitary confinement is that it's been used for 190 years for isolation, rehabilitation, retribution, and overcrowding for inmates. And the first application of solitary confinement was in 1829 at Pennsylvania's Eastern State Penitentiary. The inmate population was beginning to grow more and more each day, and the state prison decided that they should build another area just for the excess amount of inmates that were coming through, and that's when it actually started. And in 1983, solitary confinement got its definitive name at the Illinois Marion Federal Prison, which resulted in the deaths of two correctional officers by inmates. After the incident, the prison decided to implement solitary confinement to punish those prisoners, but instead of being there for a short period of time, they were there indefinitely, and it was actually not indefinitely. The prisoners were there for 23 hours a day and with 1 hour of recreation. And then Marion became America's first supermax prison because of the strict timing that the inmates were in solitary confinement for. And the conditions of solitary aren't the best. The inmates are usually in a 6x12 cell with one steel bed, a toilet, and one window. And they have about your average 3 meals a day, but they don't have it in large quantities, obviously, because they're on punishment. So there are many ways that inmates can end up in solitary, and it's not just by being disrespectful. There are also other ways that involve other inmates, that involve staff, that involve themselves. For example, if an inmate tries to commit suicide, he's going to be put in solitary confinement. If an inmate brings in contraband, he'll be put in solitary confinement. If he gets into a fight with another inmate, he'll be put into solitary. If they're caught tattooing, if they don't take showers and they smell gross and the smell isn't appealing to other inmates, they'll be forced into solitary. There's a lot of things. If they refuse work, if they're caught with money, cell phones, if they're caught with stamps, that's also punishable. And if they disobey staff members, if they have weapons or keys, or if they're caught stealing, they'll be put in solitary. There are many ways. This isn't everything, but there are a lot of ways. Now, the pros to solitary confinement are that it reduces violence among inmates. It sets obedience as a precedent for other inmates. For example, if an inmate gets into a fight with another inmate and he is punished by being put into solitary, then that's going to reduce the chance of that happening if the other inmates see that the action is punishable. And solitary establishes an environment where authority is promoted. If inmates are punished for their actions, and authority is being promoted that way because there's more respect towards the staff. And high-profile inmates, such as celebrities, can be compromised, and inmates with intense criminal backgrounds are a risk to others. Bill Cosby recently was incarcerated, and he was put into a different cell because of the security and how dangerous he could be being around others, as they could offer to bribe him, they could threaten him, and he could have been well, he wasn't safe, basically. That's why he was put into a different cell. It wasn't any form of special treatment. It was just so he could be safe. And solitary also protects inmates from themselves by keeping them isolated. As I mentioned before, the suicide thing, if an inmate does try to commit suicide, he will be put into some sort of straitjacket, so he's not able to hurt himself. Also, if inmates participate in strikes, they get put into solitary. And if they refuse to eat, they'll be force fed in solitary. So the only people who are exempt from solitary in some states are pregnant women because of the health risk that solitary may pose on the unborn child. Um, Pregnant women have a lot of needs because they're growing another human, obviously. And if they don't have the right nutrients, it can sometimes lead to a miscarriage. And then juveniles are also exempt from solitary in some states, like New York recently. Inmates 21 and under are not to be placed in solitary due to the long-term psychological effects. The adults in state prisons also have psychological effects in solitary, but for juveniles it can be much worse. And solitary is also limited to mentally ill inmates in some states. Mentally ill inmates are, when they come out of solitary, they're in a really bad state, and it's really hard for them to adapt when they get back into general population. They experience panic attacks, hypersensitivity, diminished impulse control, hallucinations, and paranoia while being in solitary. So this inmate right here purposely put himself in solitary confinement, and that's actually really uncommon unless the inmate is under immediate threat, or if they purposely decide to act up and need solitary to get away from the supposed idiots that are in their cell. So the significance of solitary confinement is that it supposedly breaches the Eighth Amendment because it's cruel and unusual, according to some officials. And solitary confinement isn't cruel or unusual because it's used as a corrective measure, and it's just to correct behavior. It's not actually put in place to cause mentally ill inmates to get any worse or give mentally ill worse symptoms, and it results in a safe environment for the inmates in the prisons and the correctional officers and the other figures. And in maximum security prisons, solitary is essentially keeping inmates confined to their cells for 23 hours a day and with 1 hour of recreation. And I don't think that violates the Eighth Amendment because the criminals have done really bad crimes, and giving them too much freedom would let them think that the law is malleable, and it's not. This is an example of a court case that is a perfect example of why solitary shouldn't stop. So Albert Woodfox is a convicted murderer at Louisiana State Penitentiary. He and two others were charged with killing a correctional officer, and he filed a complaint against the state of Virginia, saying that solitary confinement against death row inmates violates his rights because he was on death row while he served his time in Virginia. So inmates on death row really have nothing to lose, and I don't think there's really anything that stops them from using intimidation and try to get other inmates to be in gangs. So I think it's really important that we address the issue and we address the nature of the crimes before deciding if solitary is actually something that we should use. I think that if the crime is really severe, then solitary should definitely be an option. But if it's a less severe crime, if the person commits a less severe crime and they are insubordinate, then I think that they should be put in solitary for at least just 15 days, as some psychologists recommend. So some solutions are that solitary confinement be reformed, not that it be removed from prisons. By reforming it, you can limit the duration that inmates are in solitary for. And our psychologists recommend that they stay in for 15 days minimum, nothing over that, because after that, the psychological effects become really bad. Another solution is that inmates in maximum security prisons should not be given more than 1 hour they have for recreation, because obviously due to security reasons, the inmates communicating with each other would be really bad because they could be conspiring against other people. And I think that providing them with necessary resources should be required. Rehabilitative programs, educational programs, medical and mental health treatment, or some of those resources. And that is all. Thank you.